Back in 2012, I was a senior in high school. At one time, I babysat the infant son of a couple who were close family friends of ours. I put the baby down to bed early, probably 8 o'clock or so, I'd say. He slept upstairs while I chilled downstairs in the living room, just watching TV with the baby monitor nearby. The parents said that they'd be back around midnight or so. At around 11 o'clock, I heard the baby screaming through the baby monitor, and I don't mean crying, I mean screaming. I worked at a daycare all through high school, and even to this day, I have never heard a baby scream like this. It didn't sound like he was upset or crying for food or a diaper change or anything. The scream made the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stand up. Even as I type this now, it kind of makes me feel sick. It was as if my instincts could pick up on some kind of primal terror inflicted within. Anyway, I ran up the stairs, obviously, opened the door of the baby's room and turned on the lights. He was there, just standing in the crib, holding himself up on the rail with one hand. His other hand was pointing at the closet, still screaming. I picked him up and it calmed down a bit as I patted him on the back. I brought him downstairs with me as his parents were going to be home within the hour anyway, and I didn't have the courage to check the closet. I'm not ashamed to say that it just really freaked me out, as it was just me and this baby in the house. So, the parents arrived home around midnight, as they said. There was some confusion, frustration as to why the baby was still awake with me downstairs. When they questioned me about this, I told them what had happened. I honestly thought that I'd sound like an idiot, and was kind of worrying about how I'd explain it leading up to their arrival. However, when I said what happened, the mother's expression just dropped. She shook her head and just welled up, obviously distraught, and took her son upstairs without a word. Weird, because remember, these are family friends, and we're usually on good terms. But the father apologized on her behalf and for what I had experienced, and he shared that his wife had been seeing the ghost of a Civil War soldier standing at the foot of her bed. He had never seen it, of course, but he knew that her fear was real and that they just didn't know how to explain it. I never experienced anything paranormal myself that night. However, I've never seen anyone react with such palpable fear and distress for seemingly no reason ever since. The way the baby screamed and the way the mother's demeanor just immediately changed when I said what happened, what still gives me the creeps. Anyway, I wanted to share this story with all of you because it's the only semi-paranormal encounter that I've ever had, and I would just really love to hear your thoughts. I'm one of those guys who likes to think of himself as a grounded, no-nonsense person. Coming from a programming background, acting on logic is in my nature, but I just cannot make sense of these events using conventional logic. I'll get straight to the events that occurred a few months ago. So, I'd been promoted to a more stressful position, which led to a heavier workload, and eventually, stress and insomnia kicked in. After a terrible night's sleep, I battled with the decision whether I should go into work or not. Feeling guilty about not going in, I was managing the department at the time, I phoned in with an honest excuse to the staff that I was meeting that day and tried to get some more sleep. While sleeping, I vaguely remember a guilt-driven dream about going into work at my normal hour that day. When I finally turned up, about lunchtime I'd say, I alluded to my lateness to my receptionist, and she looked confused and said, "But you were here earlier this morning." I said that she must have been mistaken and was probably thinking about yesterday, a day when I did come in early, but she insisted that I was in and even got another employee to back her up. He said something like, "We both saw you this morning. I remember it clearly." I just kind of laughed it off, leaving the receptionist and myself confused. I proceeded to the room that I had my appointment in, and there was no such confusion with the rest of the staff. I told them of the receptionist's confusion, and we laughed it off too. The jokes must have made it back to her because, as I proceeded with the meeting, the receptionist knocked and came in and adamantly stated that she had seen me and she wanted to clear it up. I guess that she just didn't want to look crazy in front of everyone, and I could tell by her attitude that she was 100% convinced that she had seen me come in this morning. With a bit of a joking attitude and to clear up the matter for good, I called my fiancé in front of everyone on loudspeaker who was home all morning. I asked, "Can you remember what time I got up and I didn't leave the house sleep driving or anything, did I?" She corroborated my story, and the receptionist proceeded to turn a slightly paler shade. I then became convinced that she and the other employee who was at the reception saw something, but I felt like I'd embarrassed her, so I just kind of left it at that for a bit. This actually became a bit of a running joke for weeks, though. I would say, I wish I could be in 2 places at a time with this workload, etc., and it just seemed like the best way to deal with it at the time, but about a month later came the second event. So, my fiancée came into the living room on a quiet Sunday looking very confused. She explained that she had followed me into my home office room from the kitchen. She apparently saw me entering wearing completely different clothes to what I had on that day and wanted to ask why I'd changed clothes. According to her, I was wearing my grey t-shirt, although I had a green t-shirt on while sitting on the sofa. She again was adamant of the event, and she walked into the office and saw that there was no one there. The hair stood up on my neck as I remembered the incident at the workplace, and although I don't necessarily believe in such things, I started searching Google for similar paranormal experiences. I read some stuff about doppelgangers, and contrary to my usual logical attitude, I never wore that t-shirt ever again. The third event pertains to a recent dream that synchronizes to my fiancé's. I remember bits of the dream, especially the very emotional part. There was a playful, childlike character in my dream, much like me when I was young. I somehow knew it was my brother, though, and I asked my mum why my brother was not grown up. She started to cry in my dream and with great sadness said he never had the chance to grow up. I woke up emotionally rattled from the dream, most of which I can't remember. I blurted out to my fiancée, though, that I just had a dream that I had a brother, expecting a dismissive reply from her. I often share my dreams when I can remember them with her, which is pretty rare, mind you, but we usually just laugh at them and move on. Instead, as she woke up to my statement, she sleepily replied, "I had a dream that you told me that you had a brother, and that we were on a boat." Again, there were chills up my spine, but there was nothing about a boat in my dream that I can remember anyway. We ended up just putting it down to talking to each other in our sleep or something, and it was the only rational explanation that we could come up with. It's worth noting too that around the time of these events, 2 significant events happened in my life. One was actually having a drug relapse fueled by my insomnia. I'm actually an alcoholic addict. I've been clean for 7 years and clean today now too. The other was a massive life change involving leaving my job to set up what became a successful business with far less stress than my 9-to-5 job. Anyhow, I've probably rambled too much at this point, and I suppose that I'm looking for opinions outside of my normal framework of thinking and to just offload this story to get it off my chest. Thanks for listening to my story, and any feedback would be much appreciated. When I was 18, I was lying on my stomach on my bed playing my 3DS. All my lights were on, and I was gearing up to set my game aside to actually go to sleep. Before I did, though, I started to hear this horrible sobbing. It was honestly the saddest, most gut-wrenching sound that I've ever heard, and it sounded like a man just completely losing it, forgetting all the emotional training that he'd had in his life and just letting it all go. It was like a high-pitched male howling and crying, and it was just so painful just to listen to it. I immediately thought that it was my dad or something. He sleeps just above me, separate from my mother due to his snoring, and my grandfather has been really sick for years too. I figured that my grandpa must have just passed away or something. I didn't think much of ghosts or anything and just left my room at that point, went up the stairs and woke my mother up. But by the point that I had left the room, the sobbing had stopped, and when I passed my dad's room to tell my mum, I couldn't hear the crying anymore. Again, I didn't think anything of it for whatever reason and just figured that he was gaining control of himself. I woke my mum up and told her that I think Grandpa died. She got this look on her face like, oh shit, and got up. I thought I was emotionally gearing up for the death of a family member, so I left her to it and started just messing around in the kitchen to get a drink and to just keep myself busy. I heard my mum go into my dad's room and I could hear him go, I got this kind of feeling in my gut that said he was asleep, and I began to get fearful at that point. But I just kind of brushed it off as me reading too many unresolved mystery stories or something. My mum came out after a little bit and looked at me really quizzically. She said, everything's okay, he was asleep. At this point, I started to shake and I began to cry immediately. I was shaking so bad that I couldn't actually stand, and my mother had to come over and hold me up. I mean, I knew exactly what I had heard and was also letting out all of this fearful energy that I'd been penning up at once. It took quite a while for her to calm me down and to stop me from crying. I don't remember feeling scared or full of adrenaline at the time, but I do remember crying and shaking after all the events. My memory is pretty hazy after that too, and I actually think that I just went to bed and just went to sleep without much issue after that. Why it didn't bother me more at the time, I don't know. My dad said in the morning that he had apparently left a World War II documentary on and insisted that it was just that. The only issue is that I have slept under him since I was 11, and he usually falls asleep in the middle of some documentary or other. I only occasionally hear these movies through the ground, and it's always kind of quiet. Nothing I've ever heard has ever been that loud and that clear. Looking back on it, in fact, it sounded more like it was in my room than coming from the floor above, let alone on that night. Anyway, none of the other noises that might have been from the documentary made it through the floorboards that night. That much I can guarantee. My mum joked that it was his snoring, but we ran into the exact same issues. But some of the people that I've told this to say it was sleep paralysis or just plain old dreaming. For one, though, I've experienced sleep paralysis before, and every single one has been purely auditory for me, meaning that my eyes cannot be open at the same time. I've yet to come across an exception for this, so the fact that my eyes were open and I was actually playing a game at the time, it kind of wipes the idea out for me. Also, again, I wasn't even properly laying down and my lights weren't off. I wasn't even sleepy really, so I definitely wasn't sleepy enough to just fall asleep in that position. Also, during the same week, I was home alone with my dog on my lap once. I was sitting on the couch upstairs, just facing away from the stairway, and I heard someone running up and down about 4 steps at the top really deliberately about 4 times. Again, I had this weird non-issue with it at the time. I didn't really feel that afraid, and there was no adrenaline rush or anything. I did grab a knife though, but I still wasn't scared when I was doing it. It's only as I'm sharing it that I realize how weird that sounds, but I didn't feel scared at all. My body just went through the motions of kind of being scared in both situations, like grabbing a knife and checking for things and stuff like that, but I didn't actually feel fear. The sound of the sobbing, though, has always just really stuck with me. It truly was the saddest sound that I've ever heard, and I'll never forget it, ever. I do go back and forth on whether it was just a high-pitched male sobbing or possibly a female. Interestingly enough, though, it being female, there's a slightly more juicy aspect, as we actually had a woman kill herself in our garage back in the 1950s after a divorce, and we've joked about her haunting our house for years. But thinking back on it, it definitely sounded male, because my immediate reaction to it was, oh, it's my dad. And I remember it sounded especially sad because it was like someone just completely letting go of social norms or whatever. I never had any more paranormal experiences in my house after this. It was just those two specific instances in that couple of day time span. Also, just for the record, I actually don't believe in the paranormal, but I also think that it's stupid to believe that there are things that we just can't explain. So, these experiences have always been in a weird middle ground for me. Anyway, thanks for listening. So this happened back when I was around 11 or 12, I'd say. So roughly about 14 years ago now. My parents and I moved from a small town to the city, and we got a great deal, apparently, on a house on a hill with a great view. I remember the day that we were moving in, the previous renters, mum and a son and kid was also close to my age. They were just finishing moving out, and I'll always remember the look on the mother's face as just being unsettled, to say the least. Anyways, fast forward a few weeks ahead, and we had everything set up at this point. And the way the couch was set up in the living room, you could see the hallway to my parents' room as well as to the laundry room out of the corner of your eye. And I shit you not, almost every single time that I'd be watching TV or playing games, out of the corner of my eye, I'd see this shadow going back and forth between the two rooms, almost constantly too, just whizzing back and forth. My dad said the same thing sometime later, as he didn't want to freak the shit out of his little kids, but apparently he'd seen it too. That was mainly the extent of it for some time too, but it was all the time. In fact, I got used to it as best as you could and sort of thought that it was my buddy, the ghost shadow. In fact, I remember talking to it out loud and constantly asking for it to not scare me if it could. So, that was fine, and we just lived with it for the time being. Time passed over 6 months to a year, and my parents got divorced. Dad left to live elsewhere, and I stayed there with my mum because it was an unreal deal, apparently. My mum used to work at a restaurant, and I stayed home alone until 11 p.m. usually. One night, though, it was around 10 p.m., and I was watching TV, and just had a weird sense of being watched. Deeply. That kind of hair standing on the back of your neck feeling. And all of a sudden, almost instantaneously too, as I got that feeling, I looked to the window. You know when you can see someone in the reflection of a window? Well, it was that, except in the reflection, all I saw was a shadow inside the room about 7 or 8 feet behind me. These panes of glass were huge too, so I saw what looked like to me a silhouette of a human. I looked for what seemed like a long time, but it could have only been a few seconds, and then I looked away to comprehend what the fuck I just saw, and I didn't move and didn't take my eyes off the TV until my mum got home, because I sure as shit didn't want to see anything else. My mum's experience was a bit more startling too. She didn't tell me this until I was a lot older, as she didn't want to add to my terrified feelings of myself being home alone. So I was at my dad's for the night, and she was sitting on the couch that I was when I saw the shadow. Apparently, using her words, her Lady of Shalott picture lifted off the mantel of the fireplace, which was in the living room, stood in mid-air for a split second, and then just fell to the floor glass down. I remember the night too, because my mum called my dad and we had to go visit mum late at night, and my parents stayed in bed together, as I assume my mum was just completely scared shitless. We eventually found out, to our surprise, that the original owner of the house was the landlord's uncle. He was apparently very disgruntled towards women, and where we would constantly see the shadow whizzing back and forth between laundry room and hallway was the area that he had his workshop before they re-embodied that area of the house. We also found out that he was found dead in the house right next to the area where I apparently saw the shadow. On another twisted note, when we were moving out of the house, the landlord asked my mum in front of me, "So, did you see him?" Needless to say, I never went back to that place. So, this is going to be a bit out there for most people, but what I'm about to share with you guys is true and actually happened to me. If you choose not to believe me, well, that's fine. I mean, I wouldn't expect you to, but just don't be a dick about it, okay? This all happened around late May to early June in 2017. So, I lived out in Kentucky and have been there my whole life. I saved up some money and brought my first AR-style rifle. I had wanted one for a while, but I just never really had the money to get one, so as soon as I got a chance, I grabbed it. I needed to sight in my gun after I bought it, and my family owns 20 plus acres of land, so I don't go to gun ranges around here because, well, first of all, people are dumb and our local one has bullet holes in the ceiling, and second, I prefer shooting on our own land. I had managed to grab a Magpul D60 drum magazine at Gander Mountain because they were having a going out of business sale, so I guess really I was going to sight in a gun and test out the magazine's reliability too. I barely had the magazine out of the box and had not gotten a chance to shoot it yet, but I looked up a bunch of the reviews and could never find one that had the problems mine did that day. So this is where things started to get a bit odd. My family has owned this land, and I've been shooting on it for decades. Nothing weird has ever happened here, that I know of at least, and I've taken people to the spot that this happened at, and nothing has recreated the feelings that I had that day. I grabbed my gun, the drum, and the 20 rounds of ammo, and went outside to cross over to our field. To get to the field, I have to go through a barbed wire fence and about 300 feet of wooded area. But the moment I crossed over the barbed wire, something just felt off. I've been over there 1,000 times before, and like I said, nothing weird ever happened down there, and I've never had any weird experiences there. But something just felt off that day. Like something just wanted me to leave, maybe. I kept going though, because nothing had ever happened out there before, and I just thought maybe I was being paranoid, or the wind and the air pressure were just right to give an eerie feeling or something. So, I walk out deeper into the woods. The further I get, though, the stronger the feeling is. I feel like I'm being watched, like something nearby is just staring into my soul. I keep going, and I get halfway, and this feeling is borderline unbearable now. I stop dead in my tracks and think to myself that something is off. Well, like I've said 1,000 times, though, nothing like this has ever happened before, so I was confused. I know something's going on though now, and when I grabbed my ammo when I left home, I didn't load it into the magazine because I wanted to hurry and get to the field so that I could get everything set up. And this is where I listened to that gut feeling that I had. I stopped dead in my tracks and loaded the magazine with the 20 rounds I bought. Something told me that something just wasn't right, and I needed to be ready just in case. Something was watching me, and I didn't know what it was or where it was. As I'm loading my magazine, out of nowhere, I just smell something dead. It just came out of nowhere, too. I'd been standing there for 2 minutes with no scent, and then, all of a sudden, it smells like a month of old rotting carcasses beside me. I look around, and directly behind me is a mangled animal that, aside from the smell, looks pretty much fresh. It was so mangled that the only thing that gave me a clue as to what the animal was what was left of its fur, which was a white-grey color of some sort, which meant that it had to be a rabbit or maybe a possum. But the smell just didn't go along with the age of what it was. Whatever I caught the stench of, that couldn't have been it. I finished loading the magazine, immediately stuck it into my gun and held the bolt open. That way, if I tripped, my gun wouldn't fire accidentally. But for some reason, I just kept going. So, I'm nearly out of the woods now, and I can see the field that I'm going to dead ahead. And that's when it happened. This entire time, I've been walking alongside of a creek. The creek turns left as you approach the field that I was going to. As I got to the turn in the creek, I heard a large splash in the water, and I turned quickly, and what I saw, I'll never forget. This thing was easily 8 to 9 feet tall and stood on 2 legs. Aside from the water splash, it was dead silent. It had very long arms and long legs, and it was a light brown color, almost the color of a deer maybe. But it looked like skin, not fur. Perhaps the freakiest thing about it, though, was its size. It looked severely malnourished, too, really skinny and tight skin across its body. I mean, for a visual, imagine taking a fully grown man that only weighs, say, 120 pounds and then stretch him out to be 9 feet tall, but he stays the same width and doesn't get skinnier as you stretch him out. It also had somewhat of an odd walk too, but this could have been caused by the mud near the creek bed possibly. It never faced me, so I didn't get a chance to see its front. It just kept walking and just never turned around. But whatever it was, it scared the absolute shit out of me. I mean, I was 99% sure that I knew what this thing was. I tried to close the bolt on my gun to chamber around just in case this thing turned around to fight or something, and I had no intention of shooting this thing unless it gave a sign that it was going to attack. If it was what I think it was, the gun wouldn't have done anything but just piss it off anyway. But when I tried to chamber around, the magazine would not let go of the round. The force of the bolt closing would break your finger if you were to try and close it on your finger. I'd been loading and unloading the magazine the day before to help loosen the spring to make it easier to load in the future. I could take the rounds out with my hand, but when I came across this fucking thing, somehow, it decides it wants to keep the fucking bullet. By now, the thing is gone, and I'm basically sitting there with my dick in my hand. That magazine never worked right again too, and I kept it a few more days, but had to send it back because it was tearing at my ammo. It would hold on to bullets so tight that the bolt tried to close and just scratched a gouge so deep in the casing, powder was almost leaking out. After it walked off too, I realized that if I had shot, I would have deafened myself anyway. The whole thing just caught me so off guard that I almost fired a round into a heavily wooded area without ear protection. I mean, I had brought some with me, but I didn't have it on. I was just so spooked that I wasn't thinking straight. Now, to answer some questions, what was it? To be honest, I have no fucking clue what it actually was. But me and a friend who knows more about this stuff than I do, we did some looking around and have narrowed it down to a skinwalker, goat man, or what I'm afraid it might actually be, a Wendigo. If you want a really good idea of what it looked like, look up the Wendigo from the game Until Dawn. Aside from the color, it is exactly what I saw. And before anyone thinks that I'm just describing the one from the game, I didn't even know about the game until after I had my encounter. When I saw the gameplay, it actually made me feel really uncomfortable too because of how much it resembled what I saw. Everything that I had seen just matched a Wendigo perfectly. The stench of death, mangling animals to scare or intimidate humans, long arms, malnourished, tight skin, most are grey, but I've heard some are brown too, but except one thing, its behaviour. They're allegedly supposed to be hyper-aggressive and basically kill anything they see or drag it off and just eat it alive. So, if that's the case, why didn't it get me? I mean, it had ample opportunity but just never did. Why did it walk off and turn its back towards me? I haven't told my family about this, mainly because I just don't think that they'll believe me and they'll think that I'm crazy. But I think my dad could have possibly seen it or something else at one point too. This is because before I saw it, out of nowhere, he just started burning sage around the house saying that he liked the smell, even though He never said he liked the smell before and had never burned any before either. Now, for some info about the land, in case anyone doesn't know, the Wendigo is allegedly a Native American legend. They're a human who resorted to cannibalism, and a Wendigo spirit took them over after they ate and turned them into this monster. I live in Kentucky, and there were and still are Native Americans here. I find tons of flint every year on my family's land, in fact, and an occasional arrowhead too, which means that they were definitely on my land at some point. My mum has a lot of Native American blood in her too, so that means I have some too, somewhere. But now for the most important part of this story. Me and a friend who I've told this story to just realized 2 weeks ago that there's a Trail of Tears site less than 5 miles away, and it is entirely possible that this thing could have come from that way. Anyway, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. I'll answer the best that I can. Also, if anyone has any info that could help me determine what it was that I saw for sure, or how to tell if it's still around, I'd really appreciate that. It's been almost a year and I haven't seen it again, but it still creeps me out.